Guidance, your weekly Dungeons and Dragons and TTRPG podcast, where every week Rich, Garret, and I pick up a subject around the culture of gaming and discuss it with you. So without further ado, sharpen up those daggers. We're going to get started right now. Hey guys, what's going on? Good to see you both.
Good morning.
It's lovely to see you.
We're here this morning with Garret and Nathan, checking in for an episode where we're going to be talking about integrating film, literature, what you read into your game, and both in direct ways and indirect ways, and how to make that happen. This is going to be a good talk today.
I think it's going to be good.
I'm very excited. I'm
enjoying the idea.
Yeah. We've been having some pre-recording conversation and things sound good here. So, I think one of the things that we should lay out before we get rolling in this conversation is that we've come up with a couple of different areas from which we can talk about this. There's the very obvious area where there are like direct from license RPG games that come out, like The One Ring, which is a directly licensed RPG, TTRPG from Tolkien's world, right? What are some other ones?
Oh, the list is infinite. I mean, there's Star Wars, Star Trek, Alien. Cosmere's coming out. That's from literature.
Kojima.
There you go. Yeah.
And so that side of it, where you've got this direct from license production of a game, is not exactly what we're going to talk about from the get-go. We're gonna chime in on that a little bit later. Talk about some of those that we like to play or that we're looking forward to coming out. There's also this space of how we can take what we read and what we experience through film and translate it, not directly, but loosely, into our gaming experience, and how we do that and how we can make our games better by doing that, which is kind of where we want to start off from. Then there's this last category of active versus passive consumption of things for this purpose. Like, how do you fuel the batteries? How do you charge up the batteries so that you can come to the table or come to the world building space and kind of like have fresh ideas and thoughts? So those are the three areas we're going to talk about today. So where do we begin? I mean, I want to begin with this in-between space and how we sort of borrow from things. And Garret, you had said once about how one of the first characters you ever played.
Yeah. So I, I'm not new to the TTRPG, but let's say 5 years ago, I was pretty new to it. And I've always been into fantasy, sci-fi, whatever, growing up, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. And when I first got this idea of playing D&D, my mind immediately went to, high fantasy, Lord of the Rings. I want to play Legolas. So the first character that I created was an elf. I created a ranger, arrow slinging. So like I gained inspiration from that story and or movie and said, I want to do that. That's immediately what I want to do.
I think all of us, maybe not all of us, but I know that if you're above a certain age, that was the key driver to getting you into this game, right? So, but Nathan, you're looking at me like, I
mean, I am looking at you like, because for me, it wasn't really Lord of the Rings. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the movies. I haven't read the books, which I know is a shame.
I'm in the same boat.
Which I would actually love to do, because my friend has the entire collection and I might just buy it
right now
or borrow it from him. But no, I and this is more of a topic for another podcast, but my first character building experience, I mean, my first real big one was Circe, and she was entirely inspired by a god from one of my favorite video games, Destiny. But I get the feeling of like feeling inspired by something you've like read about, because I've read a lot of the lore that was created for this god, and I've listened to a lot of content analyzing it and feeling so inspired to create something along the same lines and be like, I want to try to embody that.
You want to make it your own
character. Yeah, I do want to make it my own, because like the character is just so rich and complex and so fucking badass. I'm like, that's who I want Circe to be.
Right. Well, and this is natural, right? Because any of us, even if we don't play these games, right? We go to the movies or we read a book, we connect to the characters in those stories.
Right.
And we find elements of who they are that we either think we are or know that we want to be.
Right.
And that's really why the TTRPG world is so great, because it's like, now here's your chance, right? We know this already. This is kind of what we've been up to from the beginning. But then the question becomes, at least for me, is like, Garret, when you wanted to be Legolas, it's like, how do you play the part of Legolas in your character, but not be obviously Legolas?
Yeah. No, I guess it was more or less, just the inspiration. I was not, I didn't say, oh, my name's Legolas and, exactly. But I played the elf, and majority of the time I used a bow. So I just kind of took the inspiration of, the ranged ability to fight and, bouncing around and stuff like that. That was my inspiration, not directly taking that character. I mean, I guess you could.
Well, I think that was one thing that was really telling about in the Lord of the Rings. When you look at the members of the Fellowship of the Ring, we all saw what each of their individual strengths were. Maybe not even advertised or seen as outward strengths, but we didn't really see what their weaknesses were. Like when we evaluate a D&D character, right, we can look at the ability stat blocks and we can say, oh, here's your dump stat. Mm-hmm. We know where you're weak. Or if you're a wizard, then we know that you're not a melee combat tank, right?
Yeah.
But in Lord of the Rings, we were never presented with those things. Like I'm trying to think of what was Legolas's weakness? I never could even think of a Legolas weakness, right? So all of a sudden now, as adopters of these storylines, we kind of now have to think about that side of it. So there is a challenge in that way.
Right. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the context that you're putting the character in. Because I think if I were inspired by Odysseus from the Odyssey or Aeneas from the Aeneid, why was I tripping over that there? I've studied both of the characters in school, and I could look at who they are as a person, what shapes their journey. Like Odysseus, it's all about pride, and he's very much of a dick and thinks he can get away with things because he's Athena's favorite, and he gets himself into a lot of trouble, but he also loves to be the hero. And it's ultimately why it takes him 20 years to get home instead of just one. I mean, you think about in the first few books, he's coming back to Ithaca. And it was after he had bagged up all the winds. Aeolus was all right, take this bag of winds. Don't open it up until you get home. And then all his crewmates open it up. And then he sees Ithaca swept away, and he's swept out for 19 more years. And so he kind of gets himself into trouble because he's a dick. He steps on the god's toes. He doesn't communicate well with the people who are under him, which is what the whole issue with the bag was about. His crew, his men on the ship, were skeptical that he was hoarding riches from them. And you could take that and be well, the character I'm inspired to create from Odysseus isn't going to be a Greek soldier coming back from the Trojan War on his way home to his Ithaca, his Penelope, his Telemachus, Argos. But where is my character coming from? What is the journey that they're going to be going on? And how are these critical failures of character that Odysseus has? How could these be relevant to my character?
Yeah, I love that. How could these critical failures of character that a character could have become part of and that's the thing, especially about Greek mythology and frankly, a lot of folklore and myth, is how the failures of a particular person in the face of the gods, usually hubris or something that sort of drives them to think that they're better than the gods, is the thing that they now have to sort of deal with. It's the thing that overthrows them or sets them back.
Right.
And these are the things I think we really need to consider when we're making our characters. Yeah, that's a great example. I love that.
And your inspiration for that character too, as you're thinking about how that's going to set up your character, you don't have to follow the same path of how your character learns to deal with those things. You could have a character who starts Odysseus and ends up Aeneas, this pious, pretty well-rounded, great guy who's just trying to do a thing to help his people.
Sure. And your trajectory now has to fill in how one turns into the other.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And Garret, you and I were talking a lot about how so when we first read Mistborn together,
Yep.
and we were talking about Mistborn, and I immediately, you know, as the DM of the group, was like, I want to adopt this into the game somehow. And I know that there's a bunch of you out there that have either felt this same way, rolled your eyes at this, or seen this in a game you've played. And I was like, okay, so let's stop and think for a minute. Rather than creating a system of ingested burnt metals to directly relate to certain powers and be that one-to-one direct in my translation from a book to my game, what is really at stake here? Like, what in this book is really driving me to be interested in it? And for me, what I realized is I had never thought about a hard magic system that was ingested like a pill, which is what happens in Mistborn, right? And I was like, oh, wait a minute. Now, all of a sudden, there is a finite quantity of magic that is only available insofar as you can consume it. And so that's what came in our Andira's Embers, where I was all of a sudden now able to create a second magic system in the world that I had built that was based around Andira, which is a small bead of magical energy that's produced by an undersea kelp. And it's limited quantity, and it's only available on the coastal regions because that's where it's harvested. And if you consume that, you do burn it, but not in the same way that, you know, like you would burn metals in, you know, Mistborn. It was more like you ingest it and you burn it just like you consume any other food to some degree, right? So anyway, I tried to find a way to indirectly take it and translate it. So for what?
Yeah, you were creating like a magic fuel, and it was essentially just a variant of the Mistborn metal system.
Right.
It was interesting, but yeah, when you first came to me and you were like, how can I incorporate this in the game? I'm like, you know, directly pulling from it. It's like, that's a little much, but you created your own thing and it was great. Like, I mean, gaining experience or inspiration from that.
Yeah, I can't help but think that Brandon Sanderson also developed his from an inspiration he got somewhere, right? So I'll think about Dune and spice on Arrakis, and this idea that, you know, this type of reaction to spice is indicative of that planet's resource, right? And it's consumable to a degree, because if you were to leave Arrakis and go back to Caladan without any spice, you probably would lose some of that. And I feel like also I just got to throw this in there. I don't feel like the new Dune focused enough on the fact that spice was the key driver to the transportation system and folding space, but I'll leave that for another day. Just my argument. Spice is consumable is important. It's important, but I feel like, you know, Brandon Sanderson, all of these things that we engage in as gamers, as world builders, as creatives, they are products of other things put through us, the filter. And so when we're talking today about literature and film, those are our primary consumables that we're sort of ingesting to output.
I mean, you know what I love about that system? Like,
which one?
The consumable, like, magic system. Well, to start, what bothers me about like Harry Potter, for example, is that it's like magic is like this infinite supply, like this thing that's taken for granted. And what I never realized that just doesn't make sense is, how does that fit in with the conservation of energy, otherwise known as first law of thermodynamics? Is that energy can't be created nor destroyed. It's just transferred in some way. Like, where is this energy coming from? Where is this energy going? And so if you're building in a way where it's like, this is an obtainable resource that holds a type of energy that you can channel to do this, and that, instead of like, here's this infinite energy resource that we're never going to talk about. And it can do all these like crazy fucking things.
Right.
Like, I think Avada Kedavra does something like,
it kills you.
It kills you, but I forget how it does it. I think it's like, I don't remember. But like, you can create explosions or like turn off a life or like move immense objects, which would take a tremendous amount of energy with no energy consumption at all. And it's like, sure, well, it's magic, but that's like slapping the sticker on it of like, well, it can just do it because it can.
Yeah, but Lord of the Rings does that too, and we don't question it there. Right. And I think it's because magic is not as prevalent in the Lord of the Rings. I mean, if you think about it, and this is something that really shocked me actually, after I had gone back to Lord of the Rings, I read it as a little kid right? And then I went back to it years and years later after playing a ton of D&D. And I was like, wait a minute. And this is before Peter Jackson made the movies. I was like, wait a minute. Magic is not really used that much in the books. I mean, like we've got the ring, right? Which is basically like a planar portal, right? Gandalf does fire off the occasional spell, right? But there's not a ton of situations where magic is used like it's used in Harry Potter.
Right.
But it is also a system where the magical source, I mean, it is revealed if you go deeper into some of the back history and you look at the Silmarillion and whatnot, but it is not revealed. It's a soft system.
Right.
I was going to say, Nathan, how you were saying how, Harry Potter, there's this infinite source and there's no consumption or anything like that. But just think about D&D. And Todd, we've talked about this in our games before. Magic and, rules is written in like D&D. Magic's like infinite. And you've always brought this up where it's like you level and you just gain these spells or you gain these abilities unless you incorporate into your game ways to train or gain those things.
Right.
But it's just like, it's infinite. Right. There's no stop to it. Yeah. Okay. You have slots and stuff, but like you were saying,
cantrips.
It's just like, just throw this magic wherever. It's like, where did it come from?
Right. Well, I think that this is something we should make a note of here for the sake of this podcast is we started out talking about what inspires us, but we should also think about what we're critical of when we're consuming this stuff and saying, wait a minute, where does this magic come from? I want to build a world that doesn't do that.
Right.
Let's work around that and be more creative.
Right.
Shift from a soft magic system to a hard magic system. Like there's an in-between, I think, in this space, and that's the Force in Star Wars. The Force is kind of it's all around us. It binds us. It holds us together. But you have to know how to wield it. You have to know how to tap the resource. Right. And then I think that when Luke was in training and he was learning to use the Force and he used a lot of it, it would exhaust him. Or when, like Yoda, or I'm trying to think of somebody that used a lot of the Force at one time to do something and you could see that it drained them.
Right.
So it implied that there was an exhaustible amount of it, or your ability to channel it had an impact on your overall
consumption of energy.
Yeah. So at least it was addressed there, but not directly addressed.
Right.
All right. So, like one of the things, like we always have the obvious examples to talk about. Like whenever we talk about TTRPGs and Dungeons and Dragons, we'll talk about the Lord of the Rings. Right. And then if we're really getting adventuresome, we'll go outside of Lord of the Rings and we'll move towards, like we're talking about Dune, we're talking about Star Wars, we're talking about Harry Potter, we're talking about those sorts of things. But I think that one of my favorite places to go to for me as a DM is to Celtic folklore, Scottish folklore, sometimes Norse material, although Loki and Odin and, the Norse gods are less exciting to me. I think Marvel kind of hurt that one for me a little bit. But in the realm of the Celtic, first of all, I believe the Celts were the first sowers of these stories on Earth. Like they go back so far in history and their creation myth is incredible. And the stories that follow that are just infinite. And I find a lot of inspiration in that space. And so one that I thought I'd bring up here, because it's funny, I just encountered this the other day. I had heard of this before in a couple of different, once I heard of it on a podcast. And then another time I sort of glanced over it as I was reading. But it came up again in another story, and it's this myth of the salmon of knowledge. Salmon, like the fish. The salmon of knowledge is this mythical fish, and the story basically goes: this salmon lived in a pool, and the pool was surrounded by, I believe, 7 hazelnut trees. I think they were hazelnut trees, and the trees can continually drop their hazelnuts into this pool, and the salmon ate the hazelnuts. Now, these trees and the hazelnuts in them were either grown from or fertilized by the original stream of water that began life. The basic gist of the story is that the hazelnuts contained all the knowledge of the world, and this salmon had been eating them, and therefore the salmon had gained all the knowledge of the world, and this was the salmon of knowledge. So when the salmon was sort of captured, the the king or the person of royalty that was going to eat this salmon had intended to give this knowledge to one of his sons. And so he wanted the salmon prepared. And Fionn, I might be pronouncing that wrong, but Fionn was told to prepare the salmon. Fionn was, I believe, the head of a group of servants that served this royalty. So he's told to prepare the salmon. And so he cooks the salmon. He's told not to eat it. And while he's cooking the salmon, he flips the salmon over and he burns his hand. And he quickly takes his thumb that had come into contact with this fiercely hot oil, and he shoves his thumb in his mouth to sort of like suck on the burn. And thus he transfers the knowledge from the salmon to himself, right? Because all of the knowledge of the world had been concentrated into that little bit of oil that was on the burn. And so he doesn't know this has happened. And he takes the salmon, plates it up, and brings it out to the people that are going to eat it. And one of them looks at him and sees this gleam in his eye. And he says, "Did you eat of the salmon?" And he says, "No." And he says, "Tell us what happened." And so he explains that he has been burned by the salmon. And they realize that he has ingested the knowledge of the world. And so they make him eat the rest of the salmon. And Fionn becomes this incredible warrior, this almost like a demigod. And whenever he needs to tap that knowledge, whenever he's faced with a question that he wants to know the answer to, he'll bite his thumb to help unleash it. And so this is not your garden variety typical, like common myth story. And I'm like, God, there's so much I could do with this in my game.
And while you were telling this, I was remembering this like thread that popped up on my Instagram feed, which is a miracle because I don't use Instagram anymore. I have an app timer I just downloaded. So
good for you.
Never on it. Thank you.
Good for you.
The fucking problem. But anyway, so I'm going to describe this analogy. I don't know who wrote it. Take note that this is not my original thought, but it was something about like, what is like, if you were to suddenly gain like all the knowledge in the universe, what is the type of insanity from that? Or like, what is insanity from seeing things beyond your comprehension?
Like Future Shock.
Right. So like, their analogy was that if an ant saw a laptop, they wouldn't like shit bricks and like become insane. It would just be another like terrain piece for them. But if for one instant the ant saw the laptop and suddenly understood all the intricacies of how it works, and then understood all the intricacies of humanity and love and loss and happiness and grief and strife and like community, like if the ant suddenly understood all these things and then it was gone, they would have felt like infinitely more than they've ever felt in their entire lives, and they can never feel that again. And it drives them fucking insane.
So what I love about that, in conjunction with the salmon of knowledge, is now imagine you bring this into your game, right? You're a GM, you write this into your game. So I actually, and I'm going to take this away now. I'm going to take this out of my actual game because I wrote this into my game, but now I'm going to take it out of my game because you guys know and everyone's listening. So I'm going to take it out. But there's a town.
Not everyone.
There's a town. True, not everyone. There's a town in my world building that has a small man-made pond in it. And in the pond are these fish. And if somebody were bold enough to steal one of the fish from the pond and cook it, I would give them a +2 wisdom bump, right? Just for cooking this fish. Typically wisdom bumps or any kind of ability score bump either comes from leveling or comes from some kind of ring or magical item. I would give it to you for cooking a fish because I feel like that. Now, what you're saying about Future Shock is it's sort of like, oh, now all of a sudden you've got this bump in wisdom. What price does it come with? Right. Do you have to make a saving throw? Otherwise, you get an equal detrimental attribute that comes along with it, which is perfectly acceptable.
And this, take note, this is Todd taking the story elements that we've just discussed, like this myth and what I had read about on the internet, and translating it into into an actual in-game element. Yeah. So like this is the process Todd is showing you right now.
Yeah, because we didn't discuss this beforehand, but I'm really enjoying the fact that we're figuring this out.
Yeah.
And can I just talk about Future Shock for a second? Because there's an interesting way to describe this, right? So imagine you take someone from 400 AD, right?
Yeah.
And you bring them to 2025 and you hand them a cell phone. Now, this is different from the ant because now the cell phone is designed to fit in the hand, and someone from 400 AD has a hand that's exactly like ours, right? But their dexterity has not evolved over the last 1700 years or 1600 years to do the things that we now do. Scrolling, for example, something really simple. But on top of that, the ability to instantly communicate with someone through a glass screen that might be on the other side of the world will shock them to a degree to which they suffer possibly even death. Future shock can cause death. It can be so absolutely shocking, right? So also there's evolutionary, just like I suggested with the scrolling, there's evolutionary potential for this in that somebody from the 4th century AD would not understand how to drive a car no matter how much you showed them, simply because their hand-eye coordination has not been tuned over hundreds of years as ours has.
Right.
So interesting thought. And I like the way this we should really think about that. We should really think when we're developing our characters. It's like all of a sudden you gain 4 spell slots because you go up a level. What could that possibly come with consequence? I mean, nothing drives me more crazy than the cleric and the way the cleric receives their spells all at once from a god. It's like, I don't know. That god must have a heck of a lot of confidence in its people to absorb all that at once.
It was making me think, you two going back and forth about the salmon of knowledge, the, future shock, ingesting all this stuff. Made me think, have you guys, either one of you seen the movie Limitless?
No.
Oh.
It's...
Maybe.
I forget. Was it Bradley Cooper? I think it's Bradley Cooper. But it is this pill, and it makes me think of the magic system that you created. That there's this. These scientists unlock the ability to use 100% of your brain, and if you took this pill, you were like this superpower. You could run at your mind. He creates like this novel in like an hour. And like he unlocks the potential of his like 100% of his brain, and he's running like it's a drug essentially, but then there's side effects to it. And like, then, he's withdrawing from it. And like, he doesn't realize that he was up for 96 hours and then he just crashes and he's asleep because he doesn't realize that he's coming down from this thing. But then like the supply runs out, and then there's this fighting and feud over it because, but then they figure out how to like synthesize it the correct way or something like that. So it's like taking inspiration from something like that.
Right.
You could go like infinite with that. Like you were talking about like the future shock or the knowledge. And it's just something like that where it's like you ingested it. And it was cool.
I like that.
It was interesting.
I like that.
It made me think of it when you two are talking back and forth.
Yeah. And even that notion is inspired by scientific study that made the papers, and the papers are only really good at misrepresenting science. And they had interpreted it as like humans only use like 10% of their brain. And like, if you use the other 90%, like what else would happen? And there were other movies inspired by that.
I think it's like
Lucy,
been done.
Lucy. I don't remember.
No, I think
Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, I think Lucy's on the same premise.
Yeah.
There's a couple of movies that are like that.
Yeah. Well, again, here's another example is if you start getting into movies that deal with time travel, all of a sudden you can sort of unlock a whole bunch. And Interstellar is one, but even if you look at another Christopher Nolan movie called Memento, which is produced, or I should say cut in such a way that it's kind of moving backwards and forwards at the same time.
Fucking love Memento.
Memento's amazing. But what if, imagine if for a minute you took the basic formal premise for how it's cut and built your world or your storytelling around that.
That's what we're talking about here.
All right, listen, you guys, we got to take a break. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about the notions of active versus passive kind of consumption of things. And then let's get into some of those direct RPG from license kind of game situations and talk about those. But let's run off the break and we'll be back in a few. See you in a bit. Hey everybody, Todd here, and I am super excited to tell you about what we've got coming up on our YouTube channel. So for those of you out there who love to watch live play Dungeons and Dragons, and you really like combat, but oftentimes these channels just don't do combat well. So we're going to be introducing a new segment to our channel called The Pit. What we're going to be doing on The Pit is the second and fourth Tuesday of every month, we're going to be playing live arena combat at the table. So basically imagine this. Everybody comes to the table with a character. That character is themed somehow. So this upcoming theme that we're going to have on February 25th is basically bring a character that's level 15. Those characters are going to come into the game. They're going to visit a room of items. Everybody picks an item and then they get dropped onto the arena fighting floor. And I, the DM, provide the foe. And then we engage in it all. We roll for initiative. We make attack rolls. We run around the arena trying to kill. And it's basically everybody versus that foe. Then we take a break. And after the break, when we come back, imagine arena style fighting a la Hunger Games. All of the players that come to the table are going to fight each other, but all of their stuff is in the middle of the pit. So initiative is rolled. Everybody runs out to get their things. And the battle ensues, and one person is left standing. So we have a great set of terrain. We've got this beautiful coliseum that we've built. I'm going to be going crazy with the resin printer and trying to paint the daylights out of these minis on time for this whole event to take place every 2 weeks. And we're going to be bringing this to you, hopefully, in some beautifully shot, high resolution graphics. So hopefully this is going to kill. So come over to YouTube, Wither and Bloom Studios on YouTube, and follow us and watch The Pit. Come along for the joy. You're actually going to be able to, in the chat, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can buy the players bonuses like healing potions, re-rolls, different weapons. You'll be able to purchase those things and drop them to them so they can have a chance of surviving. So come check out The Pit. We're looking forward to having you. Second and fourth Tuesday of every month. We'll see you there. All right, we're back from the break, and I got to say that when we were on the break, our conversation was going really well, and I thought about how, Garret, you were talking about this pill from Limitless. Limitless, is that it?
It was Limitless, yeah.
And how this pill unlocks the full potential of your brain. And then I was thinking about the consumable aspects of what we talked about with both, Mistborn and our version of that, Andira, and some other things like that. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if your leveling up of your magic was not done through experience, but it was done through the level of the consumable, and therefore did not come sequentially, but could come in any order. So if you accidentally ingested a high level consumable that you were not capable of dealing with yet, the consequences could be out of control.
Like, you just take too much and you're just fucking geeked and shooting fire tips out your fingers.
Yeah, exactly. And you're like killing your party members, and it's like wild magic and completely out of control.
You have no idea how to control it.
And the thing is it doesn't go away quickly. Like, you got to wait for it to wear off.
You got to sit down and drink some water.
I want to write this module. You got to sit down and drink some water. Yeah, it's like you had too many shots of espresso.
Yeah.
I want to write this module.
Got to stop this.
Speaking of too many shots of espresso.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I have this guy at work. It's a new employee. This guy, one of my coworkers, went to use the coffee machine the other day. It's out of beans. It's out of water. He starts filling it up. And one of the main guys that deals with the coffee machine was like the new employee literally consumes like 15 plus cups of coffee from this espresso machine that we have at work. He says he's running out of beans. He's running out of water. And this guy is literally like bouncing off the walls all day. He can't sit still.
He's going to have heart failure.
He's crazy. We think, it might be a clutch to something else.
Yeah.
That, he's not doing at work. Yeah.
Right, right.
But this guy is just like you were saying, just off the walls. Too much espresso. It made me think of this guy.
Holy.
He's having his high level consumable.
Yeah.
All right, should we read a listener comment?
Yeah.
Okay. So from last week's podcast, which the weather was hell, so you guys weren't able to make it.
Yep.
And I did a podcast on, do you have low commitment players? And so one of our comments from Mr. Fro TW said, I'm a big believer in no D&D is better than bad D&D. So when it gets to a point where half the group was struggling to meet every other week, I just put the game on a hiatus. If a player consistently can't make it, then I agree. They don't want to make it. I'm not in the business of forcing people to play with me no matter how much I want to play. This all being said, I'm now in an odd situation where the players meet on time, but they don't actively participate in the game. Any questions or decisions they have to make is preempted with silence and wait, what? This is no doubt due in large part to the game being virtual. But we're scattered across the country and globe. So this is not, so it's this or nothing. And I'm really starting to look at that nothing, which is, cool that they're coming, but it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
I've been in this situation before.
Yep.
And my response actually to Mr. Fro TW was, that's a tough one. Have you expressed to them that you're feeling the engagement needs improvement? Perhaps this is a conversation asking them what would make them more connected. Which, I would do that. I would address my players and say, hey, guys, I feel like we need a better connection. What am I doing wrong? Or what would make your game more fun? You first.
I was just going to say, I know the Zoom space, it's a great place to, like you said, connect with people that are scattered throughout the country. And we experienced that through the pandemic. And it was great. But it is distracting. And there are, I think, maybe like you said, Todd, you got to kind of sit down and really discuss it.
Yeah.
Because, if you're putting time and effort into creating this game for these people and you're not getting the response or dedication really from these people, I can see the struggles in that. We went through that.
Yeah, we totally did. And Mr. Fro TW and I go back and forth a little bit on this. And ultimately he lands on, that he sat them down and he talked to them about what it takes to be a hero and what it takes to make the game work. And he ends with, despite all this, they do mostly show up session after session. So something must be going right, which,
right.
Cool for him looking at the good side of all of this. But I think, oftentimes these games are complex and we really need to kind of have check-ins with our players to make it work. So I thought that was a great conversation. I'm glad we managed to get that out of somebody.
Yeah. I agree with you on the check-ins. The session 0 is amazing, but I think throughout campaigns, especially if you're struggling, revisit it.
Yeah. 100%.
Sit down, talk.
I'd also say this is great everywhere in life, but as a general rule of thumb, don't spend your energy where you're not going to be appreciated. If you're not feeling appreciated for all the work you put in, that's not fair to you. It might suck to go no D&D, but if you go new D&D, that puts you in a position where you can take steps to find other options. I mean, if you want to continue on the Zoom route, you could find streamers or YouTube groups that usually have a Discord community, and those Discord communities are full of people looking for games.
Right.
Yeah.
There are probably clubs around you or organized D&D games around you. It takes a little bit of looking, but taking a break will open you for opportunities, other better opportunities.
Well, one of the things that I think this helps me with immensely is in the next section of our talk this morning. And that is, I am often very down on the virtual space for playing these games. I don't like Discord and Zoom for games, but that's just me. And I understand they help a lot of people, but I try to take that balanced approach when I talk about them. Because to me, this is about active versus passive, right? And active versus passive, when we're talking about consuming things like literature and film and kind of becoming storytellers, is also really important. And when I set out to do the research for today's show, one of the questions I asked the Google is, I basically was like, what's better? I didn't word it this way, but this is the general gist of the question. I was like, what's better, reading or listening to an audiobook? Because I have a certain member of my Is this a member of my family? I am acquainted with someone who is a rather high person at a certain very popular audiobook company. And I always sort of railed against audiobooks because I'm just like, because I'm a reader, right? And, I always thought that the act of reading was pinnacle. That was the only way to get it done. But then when I asked the Google this question, I found an article in Psychology Today, which isn't a bad rag to read. And it basically, the author of this was talking about the science behind it that basically says that cognition and retention and comprehension are all going to be higher if you physically read. But the audiobook, for all the sort of bad things we say about it, offers an opportunity to consume a book that you otherwise might not take because you can listen while you're driving.
Right.
Which you'd never read a book while you're driving, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a chance to actually take in more material. And I think that's a good thing. So here, this is now my take on Zoom. It is a chance to play more Dungeons and Dragons, even if it's not the best way to do it.
Right.
And so I'm kind of finding some balance here.
Right. Yeah.
I
can agree on that.
But this idea of active versus passive, I want to talk about that because so many people are pulling from film, and there's nothing wrong with that. But earlier, you guys said you had not read Lord of the Rings.
Okay. And
okay, so I knew he was going to roast us for this one. So to get back to it, the reading versus listening, I would not have made it through Mistborn, or I would not have made it as far as I am in the Stormlight Archive without audiobooks. And I am totally under the agreement that reading it physically, you're going to retain it more. When I was younger, I mean, I was a huge, I read Harry Potter. I read Harry Potter so many times. That was my growing up.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
That was my thing because I was in that era of when they were being released.
Sure.
And I physically read them. And I did listen to them in the audiobook, but I agree, reading them, you gain so much more. But I'm a busy person,
Right.
I, full-time job, taking care of my daughter. I have so much going on. But the fact that I can listen to an audiobook while doing the dishes, while cooking dinner, while driving to work, all those things, I'm actually able to bring in that information. So I did start to listen to Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's on the topic of accessibility too. I mean, even if it's like, I can't make time in my day to sit down and read, I can listen. There are people who can't read for one reason or another who can listen to it and absorb all that information. But two, like they offer different like perks, I think.
I totally agree. And listen, I'm knocking you guys a little bit because I know both of you can read.
Yeah.
Right. And don't get me wrong. I am not going to knock or thwart the accessibility channel here.
Right.
Right. But I'm talking to both of you specifically. Right. So, okay, let me ask you a question. All right. And the listeners out there, maybe the listeners will know this. So I'm going to ask this little trivia question. Now, you've both seen Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Correct?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So here's a question for you. In the Fellowship of the Ring, we all know that we celebrate Bilbo Baggins's 111th birthday, right? And after that, during that party, Bilbo puts on the ring, disappears back up to Bag End, right? And promptly packs his things to leave. And as he's doing that, Gandalf is there. And Gandalf asks him to leave the ring, which he does. And after Bilbo sets out on the road on his journey, Frodo comes home. And Frodo sees the ring laying on the floor and he picks it up and he has a discussion with Gandalf. And that is when Gandalf realizes some things about the ring and realizes that he has to go investigate the ring. And so he says to Frodo, keep it secret, keep it safe. And he leaves. Remember this? And then he comes back after finding out all these things when he travels to Minas Tirith and he goes through the scrolls and he drinks the tea and he smokes the pipe and he's looking to find out if this is actually the One Ring. And then he returns. How much time passed from the time he left Frodo to the time he returned? How much time passed?
I can't fairly answer this because you told me this.
Yeah, you did tell me this too.
50 years.
I didn't realize it was that much.
50 fucking years
passed in the book. Okay. Now, that is really significant in terms of all of this story's development. Okay. No dig on Peter Jackson for completely snuffing that out of existence. He snuffed out a lot of things in the movie, but it's still a fantastic movie. Yeah, Tom Bombadil, of course. But my point here is this, is that there is a scope and scale to the time in the book that is only comprehensible to the reader, right?
Right.
And because of the film's sort of the film space itself, that's an impossible situation. Not an impossible situation, but it's a decision-making space that Peter Jackson had to sort of be in.
Right.
And he did what he did. Fine. I'm not going to criticize that. I think that it's up to him to do that. That's his creative right. However, I feel like, God, if you read the book, it's so different. It's so different.
Yeah.
I mean, okay. All jokes aside, I feel like as DMs and GMs and storytellers, and let's take this another step. Okay. Let's go into, we are constantly talking about lore and in folklore.
I fucking love lore.
Right. Well, the difference between folklore and lore and folklore are basically the same thing, except lore is specific to the stories and folklore is more centered on all of the traditions that might be passed down. And what these are passed down through is repetition, right? So storytelling,
ritual.
the act of storytelling is an active thing, right? Now look at how much TTRPGs and even the word lore has grown in popularity over the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And I'm wondering, why is that happening? Because frankly, storytelling and world building and a 4-hour game of Dungeons and Dragons is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right. And I believe that this is the equal and opposite reaction to this element of social media.
Right.
And how we're scrolling through this, completely disassociated random collection of fast moving things that take no investment whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. So social media is a trap because there's all these insanely complex algorithms that are reading from you and your interactions and trying to spit back more things in an unpredictable manner to feed your ever insatiable hunger for content.
Right. And, that predictability part is really interesting when it comes to this equal and opposite reaction that we engage in these games, because now collaboratively as storytellers, there's an unpredictability to what's going to happen, right? We lay out a framework, but we don't know where it's going to go. And I think we are the antithesis to the algorithm on so many levels. We're the antithesis to the lack of immersion. We're the antithesis to the lack of, the total predictability. There's so many ways in which this game is growing. And I think it's growing because of that.
Right.
We're reacting to that. We want to connect. We want to take the deep dive. We want to explore stories. We want to have active roles in how we do it.
Right.
And we want to take time to do it.
So I think where you're going with this, Todd, is with this explosion in people wanting to connect and create and tell stories we've also seen such an explosion in new TTRPGs out there in, I don't know.
Totally.
How long? the past few years? There's so fucking many.
I mean.
it used to just be D&D. That was my impression.
And Pathfinder.
D&D, Pathfinder.
Right.
And a few others.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's
Stu Horvath, if you're listening, I know that was incredibly inaccurate, but for the most part. Sorry, go ahead.
I couldn't even sit here and name all of them.
No, I mean, essentially there is something for everyone out there now. The explosion in the TTRPG space is just insane. And we're talking today about, film and literature, and just in the preps of today, I just went online and we know about a few, the One Ring. I mean, we picked that up at PAX. Can't wait to kind of get into that world and play that.
Beautifully produced books, by the way.
Yeah, they look gorgeous. And, our topic was heavily on Lord of the Rings and everything. So to get into that space, it's a, pre-constructed module that someone has already done, but there is everything. I was out there, it was The Witcher, Star Trek, Star Wars, Alien. You look at it and someone has produced an RPG through so many things. And Brandon Sanderson's coming out with the Cosmere RPG that, we ordered. We will be playing.
Right.
We're excited to step into these things that they're already, these pre-manufactured licensed RPGs.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's that there are all these beautifully crafted worlds and universes in the media that we do consume, books and movies, that we watch and you're holy shit, I want to step into that.
Mhm.
Like, I want to live in that. Like, I'll admit, sometimes I daydream about the Destiny universe, because I love everything that went into crafting that universe and everything behind like the fucking everything. I can't get it out of my mouth. It excites me. And I understand why people are excited by like the Lord of the Rings or Alien or, Blade Runner.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that actually to you just before you jumped in with that about Destiny, is that I think one of the things that never got answered early on, I mean, it sort of did, but it was very much about, like if you look at the evolution of our TTRPGs and we go back to Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s and we look at that as an answer to, tabletop war and combat games with a twist, the road to role play opens up and we slowly make this march into the character being the thing that drives the whole game. Right. Then it became things like backstory, narrative, role play, and we start marching through the space. But the world that it was in didn't change that much. Yes, there were sci-fi versions of this. There were there were film noir versions of this, and they did begin to open up. But I think what's happening now is that is the new place for all of these genres or these games to evolve into, are the different genres that they exist in. Right. And so that's why Cosmere coming out of the Stormlight Archive and that whole Cosmere universe of Brandon Sanderson. And that's why things like, if you think about something like Dune, or you think about something like, hit me with one quickly, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden we've got these other alternate universes, maybe the one of Destiny itself, they can become an RPG.
Right. I fucking love Destiny.
There's a spin-off. I just looked it up on the computer. There's a spin-off that's called D and Destiny, where they use the Destiny world in the 5e rule set. So yeah, there is a module out there, I believe. So there you go, Nathan. It's there.
So and the other thing I think that happens is as we sort of evolve as world builders, specifically world builders, when our players come to the table, and I'm talking about us GMs and DMs out there, when our players come to the table and they bring us a backstory and they bring us a character with a particular ancestry and a particular class, this now it cracks open our imagination to go back to the world that we're building and begin to now enhance that. So for example, Garret, your character in our game, Branmorn, has completely opened up my Fae imagination, right? And another thing, I'm not going to lie, and I'm going to do a whole video on this, but I've got a whole video coming out on the Displacer Beast and its connection to Scottish lore, which is actually kind of interesting. And it is connected to the Fae. And then I started thinking about your character, and now I've got an entire Feywild world that is coming out. So I need an army of people to materialize all of my content because it's just insane. But what I'm basically saying here is this collaborative space, this table that we sit at, right? And all of the ways in which we charge our individual batteries, right? The things that we consume, whether actively or passively, now they all get thrown in this melting pot when we come to the table. And I don't know about you guys, but it blows my mind. It charges me up so much.
It does.
And it can be anything you want it to be. I mean, you don't have to follow these modules. You could just, you took inspiration from Mistborn and brought it into your game.
My cousin Dan, Dan. Dan is working on trying to be a DM after trying to be wanting to be a player, not being able to find a game. And I kept saying to him, hey, listen, you could be a great DM. You should do it. And Dan started off with Lost Minds of Phandelver and was asking me a lot of questions on the side before it came time to do his game. And I was like, he wanted specifics. And I was like, well, you can kind of do it the way you want to do it.
Yeah.
Right. The module's a framework, and it's that framework, hopefully, fires up your imagination, calls from the different corners of the universe, all the different things you've consumed. Because we know that, we know that Dan is like a Star Wars aficionado. We know that Dan has this, and you take those things and you throw it in the stew pot and you let it all sort of simmer. And what flavors can you get from that?
Yeah. I find the most difficult part of doing that, at least for designing a sort of game to play. There was, I play another game called Dead by Daylight, and there was a chapter for Dead by Daylight that was themed around Dungeons and Dragons. And so Todd and I sat for
Days,
like crafting like a TTRPG version of Dead by Daylight. And basically what it is like it's a match based like player versus player game, 1 killer versus 4 survivors. And the hardest part wasn't like, how do we include all these different like vibes and energies and feelings from the games? It was figuring out how to like mechanically make everything function.
Well, the only reason we were having a hard time with that is we hadn't had a chance to play test it yet.
Yeah,
because mechanics are going to grow through play testing.
Right.
So, but yeah, and those of you who are listening to this podcast right now, you just inadvertently signed a non-disclosure form about our new game.
Yes. But that is to say, I find it very easy to find like an inspiration for what I want something to look like and build all the vibes around it and like say, okay, here's my starting point. Here's like all the information I have from this world. Here's all the things I want and I want to build off of. And I find it very easy to go from there. The mechanics just get you sometimes, but you don't always have to worry about that when you're building in like a Dungeons and Dragons like sort of interface.
Right. Well, last thing I want to talk about really quickly because we're running out of time.
Yes.
Is, we had talked a little bit about Iwo Jima, which is that game that was sort of that TTRPG that was developed out of the Miyazaki world.
Oh, yes.
And
Iwo Jima.
What's it called?
Iwo Jima.
Iwo Jima's from Iwo Jima.
Yes.
My bad.
I'm so excited.
My apologies to the developers of that game for completely butchering the name. Iwo Jima. We were talking about that.
Yes.
And this is a game that comes out of the Miyazaki universe.
Yeah.
And we,
Studio Ghibli.
Yeah. So what's the basic premise for that really quickly? Because that's a really interesting one.
So I wrote about some of this in my notes because this has been in the back of my mind for months, this Iwo Jima, but I haven't really looked into the rule set. But my dad had sent me a PDF, so I was looking over this. And it's basically like it's set in the Studio Ghibli Miyazaki universe on this island. I think the island is actually called Iwo Jima. It's very like based in role play. And it's supposed to be like very pleasant and very calming and soothing. And you're interacting with this like magical, mystical world. You're interacting with all these people and these spirits that coexist with you. But there are problems happening in this world. There's this thing called the corruption, which is a symptom of like a tsunami from 3 years prior in this world. As with humans using up resources and polluting environments, like there are spirits tied to nature who are very angry. So there are all these different needs and emotions and connections to the world that are conflicting and causing conflict. So the conflict you run into isn't like big bad evil guy just wants to fuck shit up because he's angry and evil. It's like people who have different needs and desires who are thinking for themselves or the people or other beings that they're like close to and maybe stepping on other people's toes in the process.
Yeah.
And so like the conflict resolution is usually through like talking or employing some sort of like strategy other than physically fighting.
So there isn't much of a, if any at all, combat system.
There is a combat system because in the manual, there are like stat blocks for these different, not like enemy types, but like creatures you can encounter. There are genuine stat blocks with like strength, dexterity, blah, 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 like AC sort of. Mm-hmm. But it encourages you to employ other things before combat.
Yeah.
Because even like thinking about Spirited Away, like it's this little girl who's like her parents are turned into pigs, like great nod to Circe, by the way, like the actual Circe. And she's launched into this spirit world and she has to, navigate her way through all these complex challenges. And she can't like go hand to hand with like the spirit people. She has to figure out clever ways to solve the issues that she's passionate about solving.
Right. The conflict resolution part is really getting me. I like that.
Yeah.
It's about ordinary people.
Yes.
And the little girl, Chihiro, is she's sort of faced with a very, very large problem in a world that's very unfamiliar to her. And I love all of the sort of hints at these kinds of transitions, these kinds of coming of life transitions. So she's coming of age transitions where so in the beginning she's moving. And so the parents and she are driving along the road, then they get lost. They pass through the portal. They cross the river. There's all these symbols of sort of crossing over into the spirit realm. But I love that as a way to sort of develop an entire game system off the basic premise of his whole philosophy around movie making. Right. It's really beautiful.
And it's even like the, I guess, quote unquote, villain in the movie. There isn't really a villain. But like one of the antagonists, I guess, would be No Face, who starts out like sweet and kind of attached to our protagonist. What's her name? Chihiro. Yeah. And slowly they come, it's like a spa type deal, right? In the spirit world. And No Face sort of like feeds off of like different energies and reflects that very impressionable spirit. And so I think the deal is that the workers are very like greedy people. And so No Face absorbs that energy and becomes greedy.
Right.
Like itself.
Right.
And starts causing all these problems. And Chihiro has to be like, no, please, like, stop. This is not a good like set of behaviors to reflect.
Well, because No Face sees in her name's been changed to Sen for the sake of her passing into the spirit world, but he sees in her the qualities that he wishes he had.
Right.
And so he calls out to her over and over again because she's all he wants, but she wants nothing to do with him because of his behavior. And so you see through this kind of like setting of an example that Chihiro shows No Face that's not the way to do this. Right. And it's really cool the way
really beautiful.
It's not like someone comes with a sword and kills No Face and everything's okay.
Everything's great.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, listen, that is going to do it for us today. And I thought this was a good conversation. I
really enjoyed this.
I did too. So I'm realizing there's some episodes that are going to come out of this, right? Like one, we really have to bring video games and their influence into TTRPG space as an episode for sure. That's one. And a couple of others that I thought of in here, but I just want to thank all of you out there for listening to us. Number one. Number two, we are going to be live on YouTube this Tuesday night for Rising Session 3. Some interesting stuff is going down. We are introducing our new arena combat game on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month called The Pit.
The Pit,
which is basically, if you like watching D&D combat, The Pit is for you. So definitely check us out on the second and fourth Tuesdays of the month on YouTube over at Wither and Bloom Studios. Come check us out. Leave us a follow. Comment on today's conversation. What is your favorite piece of literature or film that you like to pull from when you are doing your world building or your character generation or basically just engaging in games in general? Comment on that on YouTube. Yeah. We're going to read it on the air.
Yeah.
Guys, thanks so much for this. This was awesome.
Wait.
What?
3-sentence backstory.
Oh. Let's get to it next time.
Okay.
All right. Sorry. I already just did the whole outro. Nathan's going to have beef with me later. People, you all have a good day. We will talk to you soon. Take care. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to iCast Guidance. iCast Guidance is produced by Todd Lambrix, Garret Brennan, and Rich Frohman. We drop this podcast every week, and we are looking forward to having you hang out for more. Don't forget to head on over to Wither and Bloom Studios on YouTube, follow our channel, and definitely comment on what you see there. We will probably read those on this show. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to next time.